public health, all of you as journalists, I'm sure, struggle with thinking about climate change and making it relevant to your audiences, because we can all be a little wonky. We can start talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and zone this and zone that, and everybody's eyes kind of glaze over. Talking about public health and climate change is almost cheating, because it's all about people. And that is sort of inherently interesting, I think, for most news stories. So what I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about two sort of main categories of public health climate resilience, some of which fall in sort of a more traditional public health category. And there we're talking about resilience to things like vector-borne diseases, Lyme disease spreading, dengue fever coming, God help all of us, increased temperatures, air quality, things that are sort of more disease surveillance, things that public health agencies are really good at and do all the time and will now have to do differently than they have in the past. And so that's sort of one bucket. The other bucket is really thinking about ways in which public health intersects with resilience broadly in sectors outside of itself, and has a role to play, but may not actually have authority to do anything. So from a journalism perspective, I think it's thinking about the ways in which public health perspectives, roles, and impacts intersect with something like flooding or a hurricane or extreme weather event of some kind or transportation policy. So I'm going to try to tease out what some of that looks like sort of broadly. Does that make sense so far? Okay, cool. I also want to stress that I think to a degree, maybe more than in other sectors, public health resilience, when you're talking about climate change, is both resilience to these great big things, big acute events, extreme weather events, but it's also resilience to sort of incremental, everyday changes. Yes, we're going to have lots and lots more days over 90 degrees in much of the country. But you know what? Even when it's not a declared heat emergency, it's just going to be hotter every day and every night when people's bodies are supposed to recover from the heat of the day. And so there's some of these incremental ways that we have to start planning also when it's not an activated heat emergency, but people's health is still at risk. Lyme disease is going to kind of gradually spread. There isn't going to be a tipping point where, there's some kind of crazy migration. It's just going to gradually spread. And so being aware of some of those incremental changes as well is, I think, a way that we don't always think about climate adaptation these days, especially post-Katrina and post-Sandy. We think about these great big events that are going to happen and less sort of, how is today different than yesterday? So with that, I'll sort of kick us off. I am a lawyer, so bear with me. I always feel like I should disclose that I am not a scientist. I am not a public health professional. I'm a lawyer. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are sort of things that local governments are doing, legal and policy tools that they're using to cope, as opposed to some of the science. And thank gosh for you guys covering some of the science already for me. So let's start with urban heat islands, which is my first area of interest. And that's just sort of the phenomenon where cities, because of their density of concrete and buildings and lots of other things, are hotter than the surrounding areas. And the suburbs you see are a little bit warmer than rural areas, but really, all of you experience this, I'm sure, who live in the city. It's just hotter in the city than it is a couple of miles out. So what does that mean, right? When you have a heat wave in the place that is an urban heat island, there are some very traditional, so this is our first bucket, traditional public health response and roles, right? There are sort of a list of things that public health agencies are usually pretty good at in trying to handle it. So we're talking about early warning systems, getting the word out to everybody to stay inside if you don't have to go out, setting up cooling centers for seniors and others who may not have access to air conditioning, handing out water, making sure everybody's got access to water. And in some cities, they're starting to keep homeless shelters open during the daytime. We started talking about who's most vulnerable. In heat context, who's most vulnerable is low-income neighborhoods, socially isolated elderly who nobody may be checking on. So a lot of local offices of aging are beginning to deploy sort of a buddy system to check on elderly that they know are out there by themselves, homeless, outdoor workers, and people with chronic respiratory disease. And so trying to set up these sort of emergency, couple days at a time responses from the public health department is sort of a core way of handling those acute events. And some cities are doing really quite a nice job. The city of Milwaukee, particularly in Wisconsin, has set up a huge community coalition, heat task force they call it. And every year they revise who has responsibility for what, who's going to get out to which parts of their vulnerable communities to make sure people know about the cooling centers, that they're in the appropriate neighborhoods where people actually need them. And it's everyone from the faith-based community to Red Cross to schools, you name it. And everybody knows their role, and when a heat emergency is declared, everybody goes into action. It's really quite well done, and they really get pretty deep into communities to keep everybody safe. So far, it's been very effective the last few years. And I guess I don't probably have to stress that heat waves are dangerous for people. This is a picture from Chicago's 1995 heat wave where over 700 people died in the span of, I think, a week or 10 days. So climate change is going to exacerbate all of this. We're projected to have many more deaths. Now we're not talking about people just being sick or going to the emergency room, but people dying over time. And heat, in fact, kills more people annually in the United States than almost every other natural disaster combined, including hurricanes and earthquakes and everything else. So it seems like maybe it's not a big deal when it's just hot out and you get sweaty by the time you get to the car, but for many vulnerable communities, it's a much bigger deal. So you've got the public health response, you've got emergency response. On the sort of more incremental everyday side, you've got cities who are trying to change their built environments, to change the physical structure of the city itself to reduce temperatures, which of course is adaptive in lots of different ways, right? It's going to reduce energy use, it's going to improve air quality, it's going to make everybody more comfortable, and it's going to improve public health. So this is a picture of the green roof on Chicago City Hall, which they put in some number of years ago after their big heat wave. And you can see in the infrared picture, the yellow is the county building next door, and the dark purple is the green roof. And this is just a blacktop roof next door. It's about a 75-degree difference up on the roof. So this does a couple things. One, it keeps the inside of the building a little bit cooler, at least the top of the inside of that building, since it's a great big tall building. But it keeps the ambient air temperature cooler as well. And at scale, it can do everything from manage stormwater to reduce temperatures to reduce energy use, all those good things. And there are a number of built environment interventions that cities are trying to just keep the temperature cooler all the time, whether there's a heat emergency or whether it's just a little bit hotter today than it usually is. I should say, in their defense, this is a little bit of an old picture. The county building, after all this press, has put a cool roof on top, so it's now probably cooler than it was then. Credit where credit is due. Kathy's already covered increases in temperature, I think, but some of the impacts that people are expecting are increases in temperature. Lyme disease is shifting as the tick's natural habitat becomes more northerly. And I should say, doctors up in the northern part of that spread may not be used to even recognizing Lyme disease. So there's a medical training perspective here, sort of non-traditional. You've got a picture of Manhattan here. I don't know if you all can see very well, but these little green guys are wastewater treatment plants and water pumping stations. And I don't think I probably have to draw the picture of what happens if they get inundated with ocean water, both to the water itself and to the ability to have sewage and sanitation in the city of Manhattan. So there's sort of public health impacts intertwined throughout. We talked about Chicago a little bit already. So in terms of legal tools, the City of Los Angeles has decreed that in December 2013, Council passed an amendment to the building code that requires all new residential roofs of all kinds, multifamily, single family, you name it, to be what they call cool roofs, which are generally reflective or light colored to keep things cooler. which for a roof that looks like this is usually not very hard. And for those of you who live in a more traditional looking house and are wondering how that would happen, that's a cool roof too. They make normal looking roof tiles now that are quite reflective and keep the heat down as well. Milwaukee, we talked a little bit about their heat emergency plan. They've also used GIS mapping along with input from their health outreach workers to create a heat vulnerability index so that they can, I talked about them targeting those parts of the city to make sure they had cooling centers in the right place and interventions in the right place. They're trying to be really strategic about all that outreach. And vulnerable communities. So this is a picture of the Westlawn redevelopment also in Milwaukee. One way to get people where they live is to use public housing. Westlawn was the biggest public housing development in the state of Wisconsin. Used to sort of look like this. They have redone it at a LEED Silver, stage 3 rating. It has everything from stormwater management to geothermal heating and cooling, LED streetlights, composting, rain gardens to manage flooding. They've got a whole urban garden that's an economic development component that they're selling the produce in the neighborhood. It also helps with healthy food access. And I wanted to use that as sort of an example of this integrated public health is in everything perspective, because they're really taking a very holistic approach, and I think it's working. So I'm happy to talk more about how public health fits into other pieces, because there are many, but I think I'm out of time. Thank you.